Suffragettes were members of women's organizations in the late 19th and early 20th centuries which advocated the extension of the franchise, or the right to vote in public elections, to women. It particularly refers to militants in the United Kingdom such as members of the Women's Social and Political Union. Suffragist is a more general term for members of the suffrage movement. The term suffragette might be particularly associated with activists in the British WSPU, led by Emmeline and Christabel Pankhurst, who were influenced by Russian methods of protest such as hunger strikes. Although the Isle of Man had enfranchised women who owned property to vote in parliamentary elections in 1881, New Zealand was the first self-governing country to grant all women the right to vote in 1893 when women over the age of 21 were permitted to vote in parliamentary elections. Women in South Australia achieved the same right and became the first to obtain the right to stand for Parliament in 1895. In the United States, white women over the age of 21 were allowed to vote in the Western Territories of Wyoming from 1869 and in Utah from 1870, and in most states outside the South by 1919. With the ratification in 1920 of the 19th Amendment, suffrage was extended to white women across the United States in time for the 1920 presidential election. Women over 21 were allowed to vote in Canada from 1919. Women in Britain over the age of 30, meeting certain property qualifications, were given the right to vote in 1918. And in 1928 suffrage was extended to all women over the age of 21. Origins. British suffragettes were mostly women from upper and middle-class backgrounds, frustrated by the social and economic situation, the struggles for change within society, along with the work of such advocates for women's rights as John Stuart Mill, were enough to spearhead a movement that would encompass mass groups of women fighting for suffrage. Mill introduced the idea of women's suffrage on the platform he presented to the British electorate in 1865. He was subsequently joined by numerous men and women fighting for the same cause. The term suffragette was first used as a term of derision by the journalist Charles E. Hands in the London Daily Mail to describe activists in the movement for women's suffrage, in particular members of the Women's Social and Political Union. But the women he intended to ridicule embraced the term, saying suffragettes implied not only that they wanted the vote, but that they intended to get it. The National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, founded in 1897, was formed from a local suffrage societies. The union was led by Millicent Fawcett, who believed in constitutional campaigning, issuing leaflets, organizing meetings and presenting petitions, but the campaign had little effect. In 1903, Emmeline Pankhurst founded a new organization, the Women's Social and Political Union. She thought the movement would have to become radical and militant if it was going to be effective. The Daily Mail gave them the name suffragettes. Some radical techniques used by the suffragettes, especially hunger strikes, were learned from Russian exiles from Tsarism who had escaped to England. Many suffragists at the time, and most historians since, have argued that the actions of the militant suffragettes damaged the cause. Opponents at the time saw evidence that women were too emotional and could not think as logically as men. Early 20th century in the UK. From 1909, the Pancake Squid board game was sold by the WSPU to raise awareness of the campaign and raise money. The board game is set out in a spiral, and players must lead their suffragette figure from the home to Parliament, past the obstacles faced from Prime Minister H.H. Asquith and the Liberal government. The People's History Museum in Manchester has a Pankhurst board game on display in the main galleries and replica version for visitors to play. 1912 was a turning point for the British suffragettes as they turned to using more militant tactics, chaining themselves to railings, setting fire to post-box contents, smashing windows and occasionally detonating bombs. In 1914, at least 7 churches were bombed or set on fire across the United Kingdom, including an explosion in Westminster Abbey aimed at destroying the 700-year-old coronation chair, which, despite its proximity to the bomb, survived with only minor damage. One suffragette, Emily Davison, died under the King's Horse Anmer at the Epsom Derby of 4 June 1913. It is debated whether she was trying to pin a votes for women banner on the King's Horse or not. Many of her fellow suffragettes were imprisoned and refused food as a scare tactic against the government. The Liberal government of the day, led by Asquith, responded with the Cat and Mouse Act. Another prominent British suffragette, Sophia Duleep Singh, was almost forgotten for 70 years. Imprisonment in the early 20th century until the First World War. Approximately 1,000 suffragettes were imprisoned in Britain. Most early incarcerations were for public order offences and failure to pay outstanding fines. The first suffragettes to be imprisoned were Christabel Pankhurst and Annie Kenney in October 1905. While incarcerated, suffragettes lobbied to be considered political prisoners. With such a designation, suffragettes would be placed in the 1st Division as opposed to the 2nd or 3rd Division of the prison system, and as political prisoners would be granted certain freedoms and liberties not allotted to other prison divisions, such as being allowed frequent visits and being allowed to write books or articles. Because of a lack of consistency between the different courts, suffragettes would not necessarily be placed in the 1st Division and could be placed in 2nd or 3rd Division, which enjoyed fewer liberties. This cause was taken up by the Women's Social and Political Union, a large organisation in Britain that lobbied for women's suffrage, led by militant suffragette Emmeline Pankhurst. The WSPU campaigned to get imprisoned suffragettes recognised as political prisoners. However, this campaign was largely unsuccessful, citing a fear that the suffragettes becoming political prisoners would make for easy martyrdom, and with thoughts from the courts and the Home Office that they were abusing the freedoms of 1st Division to further the agenda of the WSPU. Suffragettes were placed in 2nd Division, and in some cases the 3rd Division, in prisons with no special privileges granted to them as a result. Arson, property damage and domestic terrorism. Throughout the women's suffrage movement, many tactics were employed in order to achieve the goals of the movement. Throughout Britain, letters and the letterboxes that contained them were burnt or had acid poured onto them. Places that wealthy people, typically men, would occupy themselves with were also burnt and destroyed, including cricket pitches and horse racing tracks. The tea house at Kew Gardens was set alight by suffragettes Olive Wyrey and Lillian Lenton in February 1913 during a series of arson attacks that occurred throughout London. Suffragettes are also believed to have attacked the Orchard House, also at Kew Gardens, however no definitive proof was found. Hunger strikes. Suffragettes were refused the right to be recognized as political prisoners, and many of them staged hunger strikes while they were imprisoned. The first woman to refuse food was Marion Wallace Dunlop, a militant suffragette who was sentenced to a month in Holloway for vandalism in July 1909. without consulting suffragette leaders such as Pankhurst. Dunlop refused food in protest at being denied political prisoner status after a 91-hour hunger strike, and for fear of her becoming a martyr. The Home Secretary Herbert Gladstone decided to release her early on medical grounds. Dunlop's strategy was adopted by other suffragettes who were incarcerated. It became common practice for suffragettes to refuse food in protest for not being designated as political prisoners, and as a result they would be released after a few days and could return to the fighting line. After a public backlash regarding the prison status of suffragettes, the rules of the divisions were amended. In March 1910, Rule 243A was introduced by the Home Secretary Winston Churchill, allowing prisoners in 2nd and 3rd Divisions to be allowed certain privileges of the 1st Division, provided they were not convicted of a serious offense, effectively ending hunger strikes for 2 years. Hunger strikes began again when Pankhurst was transferred from the 2nd Division to the 1st Division, inciting the other suffragettes to demonstrate regarding the prison status. Militant suffragette demonstrations subsequently became more aggressive, and the British government took action. Unwilling to release all the suffragettes refusing food in prison, in the autumn of 1909, the authorities began to adopt more drastic measures to manage the hunger strikers. Force feeding. In September 1909, the Home Office became unwilling to release hunger-striking suffragettes before the sentence was served. Suffragettes became a liability because if they were to die in custody, the prison would be responsible for their death. Prisons began the practice of force-feeding the hunger strikers through a tube, most commonly via a nostril, a stomach tube, or a stomach pump. Force-feeding had previously been practiced in Britain, but its use had been exclusively for patients in hospitals who were too unwell to eat or swallow food. Despite the practice being deemed safe by medical practitioners for sick patients, it posed health issues for the healthy suffragettes. The process of tube feeding was strenuous without the consent of the hunger strikers, who were typically strapped down and force-fed via stomach and nostril tube, often with a considerable amount of force. The process was painful, and after the practice was observed and studied by several physicians, it was deemed to cause both short-term damage to the circulatory system, digestive system and nervous system, and long-term damage to the physical and mental health of the suffragettes. Some suffragettes who were force-fed developed pleurisy and pneumonia as a result of a misplaced tube. Legislation. In April 1913, Reginald McKenna of the Home Office passed the Prisoners Act 1913, or the Cat and Mouse Act as it was commonly known. The act made the hunger strikes legal, in that a suffragette would be temporarily released from prison when the health began to diminish, only to be readmitted when she regained her health to finish her sentence. The act enabled the British government to be absolved of any blame resulting from death or harm due to the self-starvation of the striker, and ensured that the suffragettes would be too ill and too weak to participate in demonstrative activities while not in custody. Most women continued hunger striking when they were readmitted to prison following the leave. After the act was introduced, force feeding on a large scale was stopped, and only women convicted of more serious crimes and considered likely to repeat their offenses if released were force-fed. The bodyguard. In early 1913, and in response to the Cat and Mouse Act, the WSPU instituted a society of women known as the Bodyguard, whose role was to physically protect Emmeline Pankhurst and other prominent suffragettes from arrest and assault. Known members included Catherine Willoughby Marshall and Gertrude Harding. Edith Margaret Garrett was the jujutsu trainer. Members of the bodyguard participated in several violent actions against the police in defense of the leaders. The origin of the bodyguard can be traced to a WSPU meeting at which Garrett spoke, as suffragettes speaking in public increasingly found themselves the target of violence and attempted assaults. Teaching jujutsu was a way for women to defend themselves against angry hecklers. Incidents including Black Friday, at which 200 suffragettes were assaulted by police, served to illustrate the need for militant women to be able to defend themselves against male violence. World War. At the commencement of the First World War, the suffragette movement in Britain moved away from suffrage activities and focused their efforts on the war effort, and as a result, hunger strikes largely stopped. In August 1914, the British government released all prisoners who had been incarcerated for suffrage activities on an amnesty, with Pankhurst ending all militant suffrage activities soon after. The suffragettes' focus on war work turned public opinion in favor of their eventual partial enfranchisement in 1918. Women eagerly volunteered to take on many traditional male roles, leading to a new view of what women were capable of. The war also caused a split in the British suffragette movement, the mainstream, represented by Emmeline and Christabel Pankhurst's WSPU calling a ceasefire in their campaign for the duration of the war, while more radical suffragettes represented by Sylvia Pankhurst's Women's Suffrage Federation continued the struggle. The National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, which had always employed constitutional methods, continued to lobby during the war years, and compromises were worked out between the NUWSS and the coalition government. On 6 February, the Representation of the People Act 1918 was passed, enfranchising women over the age of 30 who met minimum property qualifications, as well as men over 21. Before this, not all British men were enfranchised. About 8.4 million women gained the vote. In November 1918, the Parliament Act 1918 was passed, allowing women to be elected into Parliament. The Representation of the People Act 1928 extended the voting franchise to all women over the age of 21, granting women the vote on the same terms that men had gained 10 years earlier. Legacy. Historians generally argue that the first stage of the militant suffragette movement under the Pankhursts in 1906 had a dramatic mobilizing effect on the suffrage movement. Women were thrilled and supportive of an actual revolt in the streets. The membership of the militant WSPU and the older NUWSS overlapped and was mutually supportive. However, a system of publicity, Enser argues, had to continue to escalate to maintain its high visibility in the media. The hunger strikes and force-feeding did that. However, the Pankhursts refused any advice and escalated the tactics. They turned to systematic disruption of Liberal Party meetings as well as physical violence in terms of damaging public buildings and arson. Searle says the methods of the suffragettes did succeed in damaging the Liberal Party but failed to advance the cause of women's suffrage. When the Pankhursts decided to stop the militancy at the start of the war and enthusiastically support the war effort, the movement split and the leadership's role ended. Suffrage did come 4 years later, but the feminist movement in Britain permanently abandoned the militant tactics that had made the suffragettes famous. Whitfield concludes that the militant campaign had some positive effects in terms of attracting enormous publicity, and forcing the moderates to better organize themselves, while also stimulating the organization of the antis. He concludes, "The overall effect of the suffragette militancy, however, was to set back the cause of women's suffrage. For women to gain the right to vote, it was necessary to demonstrate that they had public opinion on the side, to build and consolidate a parliamentary majority in favor of women's suffrage, and to persuade or pressure the government to introduce its own franchise reform. None of these objectives was achieved." Colors. From 1908, the WSPU adopted the color scheme of violet, white and green. Purple symbolized dignity, white purity, and green hope. These three colors were used for banners, flags, rosettes and badges. They also would carry heart-shaped vesta cases, and appeared in newspaper cartoons and postcards. Mappin and Amp Webb, the London jewellers, issued a catalogue of suffragette jewellery for Christmas 1908. In 1909, the WSPU presented specially commissioned pieces of jewellery to leading suffragettes Emmeline Pankhurst and Louise Yates. Some arts and crafts jewellery of the period incorporated the colours violet, white and green, using enamel and semi-precious stones such as amethysts, pearls, and peridots. However, jewellery that incorporated these stones was already quite common in women's jewellery during the late 19th century, before 1903, and could not be connected with the suffragettes before the WSPU adopted the colours. Also, it is a popular myth that the colours were green, white, and violet, to spell GWV as an acronym for Give Women Votes. The colours of green and heliotrope were commissioned into a new coat of arms for Edge Hill University in 2006, symbolizing the university's early commitment to the equality of women through its beginnings as a women-only college. Popular culture. The character of Mrs. Banks in the 1964 Disney musical film Mary Poppins sings the song Sister Suffragette in celebration of the suffrage movement. The character of Maggie Dubois in the 1965 film The Great Race is a vocal suffragette. The 2004 film May and Jord Angels portrays events in the American suffrage movement circa 1910, concentrating on the suffrage careers of Alice Paul and Lucy Burns. The Year of the Bodyguard is a televised docudrama about the bodyguard unit of the WSPU. The 1974 BBC TV series Shoulder to Shoulder portrays events in the British militant suffrage movement, concentrating on the lives of members of the Pankhurst family. The 2008 telefilm The 39 Steps features the character Victoria Sinclair, who is both a spy and a suffragette. The women's suffrage movement is the basis of an ongoing subplot in the 2013 television drama series Mr. Selfridge, and in individual episodes of the series Upstairs, Downstairs and Downton Abbey. The song Suffragette by Nina Gordon. The 2013 BBC sitcom Up the Women depicts a group of women forming a women's suffrage movement and makes reference to suffragettes, would carry vesta case and would smoke. The song Suffragette City by David Bowie. Suffragette Sally is a novel by Gertrude Colmore published in 1911. The 2015 graphic novel trilogy Suffragette Sue, Mrs. Pankhurst's Amazons portrays the adventures of the WSPU Bodyguard Society. The 2015 feature film Suffragette centers on the British women's suffrage movement of the late 19th and early 20th century. Notable people.